you know, I wanted to get into the lore of this character, but I realized that her lore is a little bit wacky, so we're just going to talk about Azmarana, Martikadice, and Nakuldakar. So apparently, she summoned a Lord of the Pit who happened to be named Vincent. Like, I'm not even kidding. This dude's name is Vincent. How do you be threatening when you're a Lord of the Pit whose name is Vincent? Anyway, we're talking about Asmo. She summoned a Lord of the Pit. That Lord of the Pit said, I'm gonna eat you unless you make me something really tasty. So she said, okay, I'll be your servant for 7 years, and during those 7 years, I'll make you a new dish every day, and if you get bored of any dish I make you, you can eat me. During the end of those 7 years, Vincent was just like, bro, I love everything you've made me, and I really want you to keep cooking it. Are you okay with, like, being employed afterwards? Are you okay with that? And Asmo was like, sure, I'm okay being employed afterwards, but can I please get out of hell first? I'm in a really bad spot at the moment. So Azmarana, Martikadice, and Nakuldakar goes up to the surface world and decides to make a living selling her underworld cookbook, and it's an utter failure. So a bunch of imps from hell take the cookbooks and try to dispose of them to hide her shame, and they fail because turns out making an underworld cookbook in the pits of hell makes it basically immune to singeing. You can't burn them anymore, so there's just these cookbooks everywhere that she can't get rid of. She tried again to make a type of cookbook dedicated specifically to people in the underworld that had, like, how to cook elf 1001 ways in it. That was her way of trying to figure out, how am I going to make money while also being employed to this demon lord, while also, like, not being in hell anymore. I just spent 7 years cooking him a new dish every day. I guess making things for the palate of a demon lord don't exactly lend themselves to having great longevity. But anyway, that's the lore for Azmarana, Martikadice, and Nakuldakar. Let's talk about the deck. So we are going to be cooking all kinds of food today. This is a food-centric, artifact-centric deck, and Azmarana, Martikadice, and Nakuldakar actually only costs 1 mana as long as we've discarded a card before we try to play her. So let's go ahead and look at her effect and see why we would want to play Azmarana, Martikadice, and Nakuldakar. As long as you discarded a card, she costs 1 mana to cast, so 3 mana after her first round of commander attacks. When Azmarana, Martikadice, and Nakuldakar enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a card named the Underworld Cookbook, reveal it, and put it into your hand. Sack 2 foods, and then a creature will deal 6 damage to itself. Why do we want to play Asmo? Very simple. She's a cheap commander who's going to blow up lots and lots of things. So what is our strategy going to be? We are trying to first enable her, or discard a card out of our hand so that we can play our commander in the first place. Of course, having a commander that says we're going to be discarding cards all the time means we need to find ways to discount our discarding. We have 2 ways of doing that, either by drawing lots of cards or by finding ways to make sure that the cards we discard are basically free. So here's how we're going to do that. We have a discarding is free and a draw package right next to each other. We're going to take a look at both of these. Oval Chase Daredevil says anytime an artifact enters your battlefield, you may return this card from your graveyard to your hand. So all the discards we do to summon our commander, Oval Chase will basically guarantee that they are basically free. Then we have Squee, Goblin Nabob. At the beginning of your upkeep, you could return it from your graveyard to your hand. So this, as well as Oval Chase, both come to your hand repeatedly and make your discards free. The last way we have to make discards free is the Containment Construct. Whenever you discard a card, you may exile that card from your graveyard, and then you are allowed to play that card during this turn. So basically, this means that even in the worst case scenario where we are having to get rid of a ton of our cards, we also have the ability to play those cards. So next we are going to move to the draw section. We have a 12-card draw section, beginning with Hostile Negotiations, basically Fact or Fiction. Exile the top 3 cards of your library, 1 face down, 1 face up, and then hand them both to a player. They pick door number 1 or door number 2. You get whichever one they decide to hand you, and the other cards go to the graveyard. Change of Fortune, we discard our hand, then draw cards for every card we've discarded this turn. So anytime we've discarded multiple cards and we have extra mana, we just use Change of Fortune to create a bigger hand out of it. Moira Scavenger lets us discard a card to draw a card at any point in time that we choose. Faithless Looting allows us to draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards. Honor the Guard Pharaoh gives us a token while also drawing us 2 cards when we discard a card. Mad Prophet has Haste, discard a card, draw a card. Thrill of Possibility and Tormenting Voice both let us discard a card to draw 2 cards. And the Quicksmith Genius allows us to draw a card and discard a card every single time an artifact enters our battlefield. Speaking of artifacts, we have the Mephitic Drought and the Ichor Wellspring. Both of them are artifacts that draw us a card when they come onto the board and when they die respectively. And finally, we have Foreboding Fruit, the first instance of food creation in the deck. It is one of our draw spells. Target player draws 2 cards, loses 2 life, and then makes a food token. Of course, we are going to be using cards like this more often than not in the deck to make sure that we can get our stuff going and running. So we're focusing on 3 things, basically. We want to reanimate things, we want to make lots and lots of food, and we want to discard cards to make sure our commander comes out easily. And those discard cards actually flow really well with what our commander is doing anyway, because we can't play our commander unless we discard a card. So let's go to the next basic section of the deck. A really, really simple one. This is the ramp section of the deck. We have Scampering Surveyor, which is just sad robot, and then Solemn Simulacrum, which is also, you know, sad robot. Enters the battlefield, draws you a card. Whenever it dies, you may draw cards. Scampering Surveyor doesn't have the draw attached to it, but otherwise it's a very good substitute. Then we have the Charcoal and Fire Diamonds, 2 mana rocks we get access to. Command Sphere, a mana rock that can turn into a draw spell when it needs to. Mind Stone, another mana rock that can turn into a draw spell when it needs to. Fractured Power Stone and Prismatic Lens, basically 2 mana rocks that can get us a single colorless mana. Honored Heirloom, a mana rock that allows us to get rid of people's graveyards if we need to, because I love telling graveyard players they don't get to play their cards. And then we have Wayfarer's Bauble, grab any basic land from our deck and put it onto the battlefield there. Now, why do we have a bunch of ramp? Well, because your deck really needs ramp to get going, generally speaking, and we have some pretty big cards in our interaction package. Sometimes we're going to have to hardcast them instead of reanimating them, so let's look at our interaction package. These are the ways we are going to be controlling the board and keeping it nice and tidy so that we don't get overwhelmed while we basically just try to bake pies. So, speaking of baking pies, let's talk about Bake into a Pie. This will destroy a target creature and then create a food token for us. That's super important for our strategy. Feed the Cauldron, destroy a creature with mana value 3 or less. If it's your turn, we get to make a food token. Meteor Golem, blow up any non-land permanent of any kind because it is one of the best cards in Magic. I'm never going to accept anybody telling me otherwise. Voracious Fell Beast, when it comes into the battlefield, everybody sacks a creature, and then you create a food token for every creature that is sacrificed this way. So you get lots of foods with this. This card is amazing. This card is perfect. It's a Fleshbag Marauder, basically, that gives you 3 food every time it comes out. It's great. Then we have Abrade, deal 3 damage to any creature or destroy an artifact. And then we have Scrap. It lets us destroy an artifact, or we can pay 2 to cycle it, which of course discards it so we can draw a card, which will enable us to summon our commander. Then we have Feed the Swarm, blow up an enchantment or a creature. Rampaging War Mammoth. We can cycle it for 3 and X. We can destroy up to X target artifacts when we cycle it. And of course, because we are cycling it, that lets us get our commander back out of our command zone. Then we have Drakaseth, Maw of Flames. When it attacks, deal 4 damage to 1 target and 3 damage to 2 other targets. We can use this to close out games by making sure that one person takes 11 damage from Drakaseth and everybody else is taking minimal damage from it. Or we can use this as a pseudo board wipe when we are slamming it into people. This is one of our bigger reanimation targets we are going to be looking for. Then we have the Demon of Loathing. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we force them to sacrifice a creature. If we were using a non-budget build, this would be an Archon of Cruelty, but we are in budget, so we can make one person sack a creature every time we interact with their schnoz. Then we have the Dalek Drone. When it ETBs, a player loses 3 life and gets a creature of theirs destroyed. It's also an artifact creature, so we can blow it up with our own cards later on in the game for benefit and value if we need. And then we have the Overseer of the Damned. Same thing as the Dalek, destroy a creature when it comes onto the battlefield, but anytime one of our creatures dies, we get to pump a 2/2 black zombie creature token out of the Overseer of the Damned's butthole. It is a wonderful token creation factory, but it is not the only token creation in the deck. We also have a very small dedicated token creation section. Ogre Slumlord, whenever one of our opponent's creatures dies, we make a rat token. Rats we control have death touch. Our creatures count for it too. And Ghoulish Procession, our creatures count for this one too. We make a black zombie creature token with Decayed once per turn if a creature dies. Now, the reason we are choosing these token generators, normally in a sacrificey aristocrat style build, we would be putting more token generation that activates all the time, but because Azmoran of Martika Dyson Kuldakar has that special ability of sacking 2 foods to basically kill any creature, we want our token generation to benefit primarily whenever our opponent's creatures are dying. So speaking of that, we have 2 other big reanimation boys that benefit from either our opponent's creatures dying or giving them a choice for that. First of all, I want to talk about Lorcan, the Warlock Collector. This is Turgrid if Turgrid was your friend. Whenever a creature is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, you may pay life equal to its mana value, and if you do, you can put it onto your battlefield under your control and turn it into a Warlock. If any Warlock you control dies, it'll just get exiled instead. So we can keep reanimator players from getting their stuff with this. We can increase our board of fodder we want to sacrifice with this. We can take our opponent's strongest cards and use them as our particular win cons with this. Lorcan just does a lot of work for us. Then we have the Dalek Emperor. It has affinity for Daleks, which doesn't matter too much for us. Other Daleks we have haste. Doesn't matter too much for us either, except for after this ability resolves. At the beginning of combat on your turn, each opponent faces a villainous choice. Either that player sacrifices a creature, or you make a 3/3 Dalek with Menace. So either you get 9 damage worth of menace value, or everybody gets to sack a creature. Either way you win. You either get lots and lots of creature tokens that you can abuse with the next section we're going to talk about, or you get, you know, a lot of removal spells. Now, let's go ahead and talk about the next section. These are our sack outlets. We want to make sure that our sack outlets can also get rid of our food, which we'll talk about later, because we want to be sacrificing everything on our board for what we need. So, the trading post, we can use this to discard a card and gain 4 life, which of course allows us to play Azmoran of Martika Dyson Kuldakar. We can make a goat token with it. We can sack a creature to take an artifact card from our graveyard and put it in our hand, or we can sack an artifact to draw a card. So, there you go. Artifact sack, creature sack, and discard. Trading Post is one of the perfect cards of this deck. Lobelia, Defender of Bag End. We can sack an artifact to either allow us to play a card that Lobelia exiles with its ETB, or make every opponent lose 2 life and you gain 2 life. Lobelia, when it ETBs, look at the top card of every opponent's library and then exile them face down. So we can play their lands like this. We can play their win cons like this. It's just a good thing. Also, sometimes people do things like play Brainstorm and they want to make sure that the top card of their deck is ready to go. We can use this to interact with that and disrupt those strategies. And then we have the Oni Cult Anvil. Whenever 1 or more artifacts you control leave the battlefield, so the food we will be creating that we'll talk about a little bit later, make a 1/1 colorless construct token. And then we can sacrifice an artifact to deal 1 damage to each opponent and make us gain 1 life. Chronomancer can also sack an artifact to draw us a card, or it can be unearthed if it really needs to be. And then the Witch's Oven, sack a creature to create a food. If the creature's toughness was 4 or greater, we can create 2 foods instead. So creatures that we summon off of our Lorcan, we can just start sacking into the Witch's Oven to make sure that we are generating lots and lots of foods. And then the Dockside Chef, pay 2 mana, sack an artifact or a creature to draw a card. Now, those aren't the only... we're going to be sacrificing our own creatures quite a bit, so we want to make sure that we are getting those back. So we have a reanimation recursion package that is pretty deep here, starting with Unearth. Get a creature card with mana value 3 or less from our graveyard to the battlefield, or cycling 2. So Unearth has one job: summon our commander. Either we pay 2 mana and cycle it to enable us to summon our commander, or we pay 1 mana to play it and get our commander out of our graveyard after it's died. That is the purpose of Unearth. It is just here to make sure Azmoran of Martika Dyson Kuldakar is always live. Dread Return, 4 mana to get a creature from our graveyard back to the battlefield, or sack 3 of our creatures to play it again from the graveyard. Back for seconds, we can return 2 creatures from our graveyard to the battlefield, to our hand. If we bargain it by sacrificing an artifact, enchantment, or a token, we can take any of those cards that are mana value 4 or less and put them onto the battlefield as well, instead of just putting it to our hand. So that is super neat for us. Then we have the Emergency Well, take an artifact or creature from our graveyard, put it in our hand, and then make a colorless soldier artifact token. Doomed Necromancer. Sack it to return a creature from our graveyard to the battlefield. That of Rebirth, one of the goats of sacking decks. Holy shit, especially here. Whenever another artifact or creature is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, put an oil counter on it. You can remove 4 oil counters to revive any creature from your graveyard at sorcery speed. Since it says artifacts or creatures, all the foods we sack, when we get to the food section, all those foods will just go right into Vat of Rebirth. And then we have Victimize. Choose 2 creatures in your grave, summon them by sacking 1 creature on your board. Speaking of food, I've mentioned a few cards that create food in the deck already. We've got some creatures that make food, some instants that create food. We've got artifacts that create food. But what about cards that are just dedicated to food production? What about a food assembly line for the deck? Well, when we play Asmo, we get to search out the Underworld Cookbook. It is one of our 4 primary food production engines in the deck. Underworld Cookbook says discard a card to create a food, and then we can sack it to return a creature card from our graveyard to our hand. We really don't ever want to do that. We kind of just want to have Underworld Cookbook out and just constantly create food with it. Get rid of creatures from our hand so we can reanimate them later and just keep on going and going and going with this. It's kind of what we want to do here. Old Flitterfang at the beginning of each end step. If a creature died this turn, which a lot of them will be, we get to create a food, and then the next part of the text doesn't really matter too much. Then we have the Rapacious Guest here. It has Menace. Whenever one or more creatures we control deals combat damage to a player, we get to create a food token. So like creatures like our Lorcan or Voracious Fellbeast that have flying, every time they hit people, we will generate a food. Every time we sacrifice a food, we put a 1/1 counter on the Rapacious Guest, making it harder and harder to kill. And any time that it leaves the battlefield, an opponent would lose life equal to its power. So there are some scenarios where the Rapacious Guest will just get us to the point of winning a game because it just got big enough. Because it says leaves the battlefield. So an opponent can't get around this just by exiling it. The only option they have is to like steal it with one of their cards. Otherwise, the Rapacious Guest is just going to over time become the bomb that nobody wants to address. And then we have the Ungol Patrol, the Surth Ungol Patrol. We can pay 1 mana and sack another creature to draw a card and then create a food token. So these are our main recurable food generation factories. And it goes, remember, every time we play foods, we get things like the Overchail's Daredevil out. Every 2 foods we have is removal we can play with Azmoran, Markadice to the Kuldakar. We want food for a lot of reasons. We also want food because we have a Foodie Aristocrats. These are our Yelp reviewers of the deck. The Foodie Aristocrats package. Agent of the Iron Throne. If an artifact creature is put into the graveyard from your battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life. Mirkwood Bats. Whenever you make or sack a token, each opponent loses a life. And Nadir's Nightblade. Whenever a token you control leaves the battlefield, every opponent loses a life and you gain a life. So all of our food that we create from, just the food generation factories or basic stuff like the Voracious Fellbeast or the Bake into a Pies, the Feed the Cauldrons, any of those foods we are just happening to make, everybody gets to burn to death for them over time with Mirkwood Bats. And then, of course, we have a couple of board wipes in the deck because we do want to make sure that the board is kept clean. Necromantic Selection, destroy all creatures and then get a creature that was destroyed this way, put it on the battlefield. Take your opponent's best creature, take your commander, doesn't matter how you do it, just Necromantic Selection gives you options after you blow up the board. And then we have the Decree of Pain. So we have Decree of Pain for a few reasons. One, it's a backup plan. If everything gets out of hand, we just play this card and draw a fuck ton of cards because we get to blow up all creatures and then draw a card for every creature destroyed this way. But we can also cycle it for 5 mana to draw a card and then deal get -2/-2 onto all creatures that are on the board. So it's another way we have to cycle and make sure that our commander comes out. We have to make sure that we have a discard outlet as fast as possible. Speaking of discard outlets, we need to talk about the final section of the deck, and it's more important here than in a lot of the other decks that we have built. Let's go ahead and talk about the basic land, or the land section. We have 7 mountains and 12 swamps. Those aren't super important. The most important lands in the deck are these 8 cycling lands. Every single one of these lands has a cycling ability attached to it. Why does that matter? Well, We want to make sure our commander can come out on time. Sometimes that's going to involve just sacking a land from our hand. So Smoldering Crater and Polluted Mire, Desert of the Glorified, Forgotten Cave, Desert of the Fervent, and Barren Moor are all basically the same card. They have variously costed cycling abilities, either for 2 colorless mana, or for 1 mana of a generic type, or for 2 mana, 1 of a generic and 1 of a colored type. And then for 2 generic mana, you can sack Canyon Slow. Otherwise, it's just a come into battlefield tapped swamp or mountain. And then we have Ash Barrens. Basic land cycles. So 9 times out of 10, we're just going to get a swamp with this and then put it on the board, and then suddenly we'll be able to play our commander. The next cards we have, very, very basic stuff. We have some dual lands: Smoldering Marsh, Shadowblood Ridge, Foreboding Ruins, and Command Tower. They don't come into play tapped. And then we have our fetching lands: Evolving Wilds, Myriad Landscape, Promising Vein, Terramorphic Expanse, and Shire Terrace. All of them have similar abilities to help us get basic lands out of the deck. And that is Azmarana, Martika Dice, and Akul Dakar. If you still need a primer, we are functionally going to be discarding cards to reanimate them from the graveyard to create a big board state by cheating things out, creating food so we can control the board state by making sure that food is constantly hitting people. We're throwing food at people with Azmarana, Martika Dice, and Akul Dakar's special ability. We are constantly going to be generating food and tokens so that Nadir's Nightblade and Mirkwood Bats are dealing damage to everybody, so that we're not having to just attack them. We are dealing incremental damage to people, and we are going to make sure that early on we can get things like Squee and Oval Chase Daredevil and Containment Construct, so that all the stuff we cycle is basically going to be free. We will never have to worry about running out of cards in our hand when we are doing our discard 2 draws. Hopefully, y'all enjoy this deck. Food decks are actually more awkwardly expensive to build than I thought they would be. This was one of the harder decks to keep in that $15 limit. Asmo accounts for 35 cents of our $15 limit, and the rest of it is the rest of the deck. The whole deck in total comes out to $15.39. I really, really, really hope that you guys end up enjoying this one, because not only do I like saying her name, Azmarana, Martika Dice, and Akul Dakar, it feels like you're showing off when you say her name. But it just feels funny to play a commander that tried very hard to be a famous chef after spending 7 years of indentured servitude in hell to a demon named Vincent. Like, come on. Come on. She needs a win. She needs a win, guys. She's been doing her best. Anyway, that's been Asmo. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you have any deck suggestions you want me to cover, let me know in the comment section below. But as always, everybody, insert end of video tagline here. Hey, I just quickly want to give a thank you to all of my wonderful patrons who keep this show running. YouTube and Twitch are a pretty bumpy ride at the best of times, and the stability that Patreon provides me is worth more than I can say here. I'd also like to thank each and every one of my $20 and up patrons here. And they would be Red Joker, Britzkrieg, Cameron, Dren, Jemshin, Smiling DM, Poundini, Nabbity Babbity, Naomi, Isaac, Agamotto, Jordan, Ravi, Giuni, Kiratorian, Prisma, all of you, Sagitt, I'm not saying that part, and Starlight. And finally, thank you to everyone else that helps keep this channel alive. While you're here, why not check out another video? And thank you for watching.